Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Deborah Atwood, and I'm the curator at the National Museum of Bermuda. On behalf of our Board of Trustees and staff, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture. Thank you for joining us. A few brief housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube next week. We also have a Q&A at the end of the lecture. Please use the Q&A function to share your questions. Our team will be monitoring them as they come in. This evening's lecture, Heritage Tourism and the Politics of Public Memory in Bermuda, is part of the National Museum of Bermuda's Bermuda in the Atlantic World lecture series, which explores Bermuda's connections to the wider Atlantic world and the forces that have shaped the island over time. This evening, we're taking a slightly different perspective. Rather than focusing on what happened in the past, we're also going to be exploring public history, or how those histories have been shared and experienced in museums, heritage sites, and through tourism. It is through this lens that this evening's lecture invites us to think differently about history and to consider how the ways stories are told shape how the past is understood and remembered. Before we go further, we'd love to hear from you. When you hear the phrase public history or public memory, what comes to mind? Is it monuments, museums, tours, textbooks? Please share your thoughts in the chat. As your responses come in, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Alexander Goodrich. He's a lecturer in history at NC State University and a historian of the Atlantic world whose work focuses on public history and museum interpretation. He has spent over a decade researching Bermuda and working with both the National Museum of Bermuda and the Bermuda National Trust. He is also a former student of Bermudian historian and NMB trustee, Dr. Clarence Maxwell, whose scholarship continues to shape how we understand Bermuda's history today. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our generous supporters of our Anchor Fund, which made this lecture possible. I'd also like to thank the NMB team who make these programs happen behind the scenes. Alex, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you. I'm going to hand it straight over to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you to Director Strong, Dr. Atwood, and the National Museum of Bermuda staff for inviting me to lecture on this topic. And of course, to all of you in attendance. My name is Alex Goodrich. I am a public historian, and as Debbie mentioned, I've studied Atlantic world history, and in particular Bermuda, for over 11 years. Hard to believe it's been that long. As a graduate student at Millersville University under the direction of Dr. Clarence Maxwell, I studied Bermudian privateering during the American and French Revolutionary Wars. And my research led me to pursue my doctorate at North Carolina State University, where last year I completed my dissertation on the growth of public history in Bermuda. I'm excited to share some of this research with you today, and I hope to redevelop my dissertation into a book manuscript. I also understand that despite going through thousands of documents and spending years on this topic, I still come to this topic as an outsider, both as a white historian and as an American, so I welcome your thoughtful questions and comments after the lecture. But first, I've mentioned the phrase public history twice now, so before getting into my findings, we should break down what some of those terms mean. In one of the first classes I had with Dr. Maxwell, he summarized history for us in two words, an argument. As historians, we strive to understand people of the past and how they changed their world over time, using firsthand archival evidence to form new arguments. And over generations, we argue with our peers and with the historians who came before us. Historians call that historiography, which invites new perspectives to contribute to growing areas of thought. Indeed, history is neither neutral, nor is it a static list of dates and events. Public history is the practical application of history to make it accessible and usable for broader audiences. Whether in the form of exhibits, tours, oral histories, or interpretive plans at museums or historic sites, public history invites collaboration between communities and educators. And like academic history, it is well researched, but immediate to the needs of a community and often co-created, and the two go hand in hand. Now, the title of my dissertation and this lecture mention the phrase public memory, and it is related. While public history uses professional methods to apply history to museums, heritage sites, and parks for broader audiences, public memory is how communities collectively remember or forget past events for purposes in the present. It is seen most often in monuments, memorials, and holidays. And though public history may influence and challenge public memory, they are distinct, and memory is often more emotional and resistant to change. But the title of this talk also includes the phrase heritage tourism. Whereas history is the study of the past and interpretation of the past, heritage is the surviving material of that past. and it's how that material is used in the present. And like history, heritage is selective and can only tell us so much of the story. Because heritage is present oriented, it is subject to what living people want the past to do for them in the current moment. Who decides what counts as heritage is a consideration of my research. And when it's commercialized, it becomes heritage tourism. It commercializes heritage to attract visitors who may enjoy museums, historic sites, monuments, reenactments, or other forms of history or memory related events or activities, rather. In this way, heritage tourism influences the public memory of hosts and guests. So, how did I come upon this topic? Well, in 2017, I and several graduate students were giving a talk to patrons of the Bermuda National Trust, and we each shared our master's research. Afterward, a member stood next to me and pointed out a painting that depicted Bermuda during the period of enslavement. He noted that it was unusual to depict enslavement in art or public spaces, which made me curious. And a few months later, I began my journey at NC State for the doctoral degree in public history, and I learned of the difficulties of presenting topics like slavery and race relations here in the United States. So my curiosity grew about Bermuda. And so, after returning for research years later and studying institutional records and newspapers, among other sources, I argue Bermuda's heritage tourism formed and evolved in response to commercial threats to historical structures, and thus the tourism industry, amid Bermuda's 20th century racial tensions and politics. This response manifested as reinterpretations in those same sites that would attract changing tourist audiences. Specifically, it shifted from narratives that were from a white colonial focus to one centered on black Bermudians and their relationship with the African diaspora. This study will address gaps in Bermudian historiography about historical tourism and how heritage sites represent contested battlegrounds of race. It also adds to the growing body of scholarship about Atlantic island countries and how they balance attracting tourist dollars with presenting national and local memories. I would also like everyone to keep in mind I framed this study between 1937 and 2010, so I am referring to the past. And again, though the dissertation may be finished, as a manuscript, it is a work in progress. Whereas the National Trust today, the slogan is For Everyone Forever, I would like to refer to the Historical Monuments Trust as Before Everyone Forever. During the 20th century, tourism became Bermuda's main export, surpassing agriculture. In 1913, the House of Assembly passed an act to create the Trade Development Board, which is an organization to promote tourism. With members appointed by the governor and his executive council, the board quickly moved to start advertising the island as nature's fairyland or a paradise retreat. And as tourism grew, commercial development began to threaten Bermuda's historic sites. So, on a Friday afternoon in July 1937, several prominent white Bermudians met to, quote, acquire, control, display, and make available for public view select historic and scenic buildings. The governor chose a who's who of elites: Sir Salisbury Stanley Sperling, a member of colonial parliament, Dr. Henry Campbell Wilkinson, a senior medical officer, Dunbar Bell, a justice of the peace and MCP, William Edward Sears Zool and Edwin Percy Todd Tucker, who are both attorneys and MCPs, Hereward Trott Wallington, another attorney, and Lillian Hare Hayward, the curator and librarian of the St. George's Historical Society. And given his experience in the Trade Development Board, members unanimously elected Sperling as the trust's first chairman. The earliest projects coincided with the larger colonial revival movement that we saw in the United States beginning in the 1870s in the eastern United States. But by the 1920s, John Rockefeller Jr., though the son of the famous oil magnate, saw Americanism not as industrial, but as recognizing and glorifying the revolutionary period. Rockefeller hired the architects William Perry and Thomas Shaw to restore the town of Williamsburg, Virginia, to an imagined 17th and 18th century state. Investing nearly $15 million, Rockefeller created Colonial Williamsburg as an outdoor living history museum where he portrayed Old Virginia as a haven of the white planter elite while ignoring slavery and black Americans altogether. The Grand Restoration garnered international attention. In 1935, Bermuda's Royal Gazette reprinted an article that quoted whimsical Williamsburg, the pink brick ghost village which sits on the green carpet of the Virginia countryside, and it claimed that the restoration increased annual tourism to the town by 100,000 people. The following spring, William Perry visited St. George's and spoke at a meeting that included Stanley Sperling and Henry Wilkinson. Fearing the dangerous prosperity and new development that comes with business growth, he asked Bermudians to seize the opportunity before them. St. George's, after all, held 95% of its original architecture, which situated it better for restoration than Williamsburg, which had only preserved less than half of its colonial buildings. Perry believed that the towns together could cooperate culturally. Years later, Percy Tucker on the Trust claimed St. George's, quote, could be at least second to Williamsburg within the Western Hemisphere, if not the most famous town within the Western world, end quote. And so the members of the Historical Monuments Trust got to work. I wanted to just look at a couple examples. While trustees suggested sites across 8 of the island's 9 parishes, most were in the original capital and tourist center of St. George's. The building on the left here, Stanley Sperling prioritizes this house on Water Street, the site that once housed the president of the governor's executive council, Henry Tucker, also the son of Colonel Henry Tucker and brother to St. George's Tucker of Williamsburg, Virginia, stressing that American connection. In February 1939, Emma Boggs agreed to sell the home to the trust for £800, as well as assistance with upkeep of the property and allowing her to live out her life um, until the end, and so the trust could make it into a museum. The building on the right is State House, the original site of the House of Assembly, dating to 1620. Dunbar Bell wrote to Lodge 200, stationed at the house, and offered its members exclusive rights to the top floor for meetings, while the bottom floor would admit visitors only during the afternoon. As part of his pitch, Bell cited the wonderful restorations at Jamestown and colonial Williamsburg as testaments to 17th century English revival. Bell and the Trust prepared to have the architects Perry and Shaw lead the project as they had with Williamsburg. But the lodge reneged on an initial deal, and so after many delays, the trustees continued buying properties around State House to prevent commercial development from encroaching upon it. But with no official control of the building itself, the restoration did not begin until 1968 and did not conclude until 1972 after the National Trust replaced the Historical Monuments Trust. But regardless of these disagreements between the Trust and the Lodge, the onset of World War II stalled the momentum of both the Trust and the Trade Development Board. The threats of war deterred Americans from traveling to Bermuda and sapped the colony's treasury of its normally reliable tourist revenue. With little money from the government, the wealthy trustees financed these projects themselves. The war also represented a turning point in Bermuda's relationship with the United States. During American neutrality, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill offered Atlantic bases to the American military, including Bermuda, where the American and British militaries built an airbase. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the American declaration of war, Churchill visited Bermuda February of 1942, and he delivered a speech to the House of Assembly, where he said, quote, "We are now no longer alone. We are marching in great concourse in this great world struggle. In this convulsion, you in Bermuda happen to be called upon to play a part of especial importance and distinction." He then declared Bermuda and other Atlantic bases as, quote, "pillars of the bridge connecting the two great English-speaking democracies," end quote. And following the war, the Bermudian government converted the airbase into an airport, which would welcome more American tourists. In April of 1949, with Tucker House now vacant, the trustees weighed their options. Robert Tucker, a descendant in Baltimore, passed away and left the trust furniture and several portraits of Henry Tucker's family, painted by the colonial artist Joseph Blackburn. The trustees paid to have the portraits restored, and they also bought a collection of silver, which along with these portraits represented elite colonial families' affluence and consumption, which is the message they were trying to convey through the House Museum. And on May 5th, 1953, a handful of Tuckers joined in officially opening the new House Museum, an event that not only marked a milestone for the trust, but served the trustees' goals of preserving the heritage of elite colonial families and attracting tourists through the historic links. 2 years before Tucker House opened as a museum, the trust acquired two other key properties. The first, Globe Hotel in St. George's, enjoyed a colorful history from its days as a governor's temporary house, its ownership by the Tucker family, and of course, as a lodge for Confederate agents. Of all the hotel's historical inhabitants, the trustees gravitated toward the Confederate refugees, capitalizing on the site's connection to the American Civil War. Such a museum, as with Tucker House and perhaps the St. George's Gunpowder Magazine at Fort William, could appeal to white American tourists, especially Southerners, interested in historic links between their country and Bermuda, though this would not realize until the museum opened in 1961, but more on that soon. The second building, bought in 1951, is Verdmont, an 18th century mansion not in St. George's, but in Smith's Parish. It was sold to them by the Joel family. And with 3 acres of land, the alluring Green Mountain mansion housed 10 portraits by John Green, a painter from Philadelphia who, in the 1760s, moved to Bermuda, where he later became a judge of the Vice Admiralty Court. And during the French Revolutionary Wars, condemned countless American vessels brought in by privateers. Given Vermont's good condition, the trustees eagerly bought it for £8,000, which is their most expensive purchase at the time. And on November 21st, 1957, Governor John Woodall opened it as a house museum. At the ceremony, the trust chairman, now Henry Wilkinson, remarked that Vermont did not resemble Bermudian homes, but those, quote, seen from Baltimore to Philadelphia. The house indicates the transformation made by John Green, end quote. So in just 2 decades, the Historical Monuments Trust transformed from a small committee charged with preserving St. George's to an organization of wealthy donors hoping to capitalize on the post-war tourist boom. Now, by June 1957, we're going to transition era now. By June 1957, the Trust and the Trade Development Board are sort of brainstorming how are we going to celebrate Bermuda's upcoming 350th anniversary in 1959. So the board sends a contingent of members, which included Stanley Sperling, who's now retired from the trust, and Governor John Woodall, to Jamestown to observe how the Virginians are observing Jamestown's own 350th anniversary. This was called the Jamestown Festival. The host treated the Bermudians to visits at Colonial Williamsburg and Yorktown. And during the welcoming event, the governor from Bermuda lauded, quote, the democratic tradition shared between Bermuda and the United States, which makes these countries the type of places where people can meet in the search for world peace, end quote. Of course, in 1957, these democratic traditions did not extend to every demographic, but Woodall would have viewed this relationship between Bermuda and Virginia through the lens of a shared white Anglo heritage. When the Bermudians returned home, planning for 1959 began. And the next year brought a discovery that arrived with almost perfect timing. Edmund Downing, an American amateur skin diver who worked at the U.S. Naval Base and a descendant of one of the Sea Venture's passengers, spotted the outline of a keel, 3/4 of a mile off the northeast coast of St. George's, and with very little left other than the ship's ribs, it seemed to match the Sea Venture's mythology. Downing met with Trust archivist Lawrence Gurin to cross-reference the records of the Sea Venture with his own find. He then went to the board director, W.J. Williams, who contacted Life magazine. And Life magazine sent a reporter to Bermuda, and it boasted, quote, now, as Bermudians see it, the only problem is to finish salvage work so they can exhibit their own Mayflower to tourists during the summer celebration of Bermuda's 350th anniversary, end quote. And of course, referencing the ship that arrived in Plymouth. The board believed that discovery would also spur new legislation to protect shipwrecks. When Teddy Tucker and Donald Canton discovered the Spanish San Pedro wreck in 1955, they found a 22-carat gold and emerald crucifix, later called the Tucker Cross, which became the centerpiece of the treasure. Their fame inspired foreign divers to try their own fortunes in Bermuda, especially as new technologies of scuba tanks became widely available. And with no laws preventing divers from taking the artifacts and selling them overseas, it was open season. So a bill passed in 1959 that gave the government the first rights to buy any find within 3 nautical miles of Bermuda shores, and Tucker sold his treasure to the government. But challenges remain, such as divers didn't need to apply for licenses, and they didn't need to report their discoveries. Still, the board believed that Bermuda's underwater heritage, with the Tucker Canton treasure as the nucleus, could maybe allow for a shipwreck museum, which could serve two purposes. One, keep underwater heritage in Bermuda, and two, increase tourism revenue. But back to the celebrations. The Trade Development Board secured a special issue of the New York Times, the front page of which showed white visitors golfing with one putting as a black Bermudian lifted the flagstick. Inside, Governor Woodall described Bermuda as having, quote, a long, unbroken history of continuous peace, and he promised American readers that his homeland was, quote, something in this world and yet outside of it, in the calm which it offers to those who require rest, in the simple outdoor activities of sailing, swimming, golf, tennis, and sunning on sandy beaches, and the feeling of peace and tranquility, end quote. The board provided a brief history to readers of Bermuda and its relationship with the United States as a privateering base during the War of 1812, a harbor for Confederate blockade runners in the 1860s, and of course as a retreat for Mark Twain and for President Woodrow Wilson at the turn of the 20th century. The issue also informed Americans where they could see St. George's Gunpowder Cavern, where the pro-revolutionary Bermudians stole gunpowder for George Washington, as well as Washington's letter encouraging the theft, housed at the St. George's Historical Society. And in Hamilton, in its newly opened library, the Bermuda Historical Society exhibited a Sir George Somers room that displayed models of Sea Venture, Deliverance, and Patience, the three ships that connected Bermuda to Virginia in 1609 to 1610. Now, that summer, of course, as the Progressive Group is planning the theater boycott in June, members of colonial parliament also draw attention to segregation, particularly of the anniversary celebrations. On March 6, 1959, at a meeting of the House of Assembly, the members debated the budget of over £100,000 for the 1959 celebrations. Edward Trenton Richards, a black member representing Warwick Parish, took exception. He said, quote, "In a national celebration, the nation must celebrate. The colored people are not happy about the program." His colleague Walter Robinson, a black member from Pembroke Parish, noted how, quote, "the majority of the population cannot attend most of the events on the board's program." And Richards then concluded his remarks. "Some say the thinking is that colored people were not here 350 years ago. That may be so, but after 350 years, it cannot be doubted that whatever prosperity or adversity the colony has had in the last 150 years, it has been shared by the colored people." End quote. And in reference to Bermuda's total population, Richards quipped, There are 40,000 good reasons for celebrating the anniversary. More than 14,000 of these reasons should be considered." End quote. As the year continued, the Progressive Group successfully organized a theater boycott to desegregate theaters, with hotels and businesses following. At the end of the year, though, Globe Hotel, which had previously housed a segregated restaurant, stood vacant. The Historical Monuments trustees deliberated its future, but with the acquisition of a parcel of Confederate memorabilia, including buttons and flags, they imagined a war museum dedicated to the to the Confederate agents who had stayed in Bermuda. And so, in January 1961, the trust announced that the Globe Hotel would become a museum just in time for the centennial celebrations of the Civil War in the United States. The Royal Gazette article provided insight into the 1860s, when Confederate agents John Toryborn and Norman Walker used this hotel as an office to entertain merchants and blockade runners. The article showed a front shot of the Globe Hotel, revealing that the trust already had hanged the Confederate First National flag above the entrance door, next to Bermuda's own flag, celebrating that, quote, "once again, the American Confederate flag flutters in St. George's. It flies from the house that harbored friends of the American revolutionists and provided an office and home for the agents of the Confederacy during the American Civil War," end quote. And so, in the wake of a major civil rights success, the Historical Monuments Trust dedicated a museum that celebrated a racially oppressive nation state, the Confederate States of America. After the Northern and Southern states reconciled, and the Civil War became remembered more as a war over states' rights, this memory often downplayed or outright excluded the central cause of slavery. American historians refer to this phenomena as the lost cause revisionism. By the 1960s, the Confederacy was an attractive historical topic among American tourists, Northern and Southern alike. A prominent sign of the trustees' own reconciliation with lost cause ideology was their plan to have the United States Air Force Sergeant Ron Winkler stationed at the hotel's front desk, where he wore a Confederate Army uniform to greet the American tourists, and hanging behind him is the St. Andrew's Cross Confederate battle flag. On May 23, 1961, for the Day in St. George's, the Confederate Museum opened to the Bermuda's Garden Club members, and the women there enjoyed the splendid red, white, and blue arrangement of Easter lilies, amaryllis, and cornflowers. Sergeant Winkler, masquerading as the Confederate soldier, proudly responded to a woman who asked him if he was a real Southerner, and he said, "Yes, ma'am, I'm from North Carolina." While one might argue that the trust simply found perfect timing for the museum's opening, it did so as Black Bermudians campaigned for the universal franchise and to eliminate barriers in employment, housing, and education, and presented a history of Bermuda that erased any semblance of public opinion divided about the Confederacy. Later on in 2015, in the wake of the Charleston church shooting, Bermudian journalists reflected on the museum and clarified that while some in the island's mercantile elite did favor the South, the common man's sympathies were overwhelmingly with the North, hardly surprising in an island with a large black population, which itself had only abolished slavery only 30 years prior. The writers called the Confederate Museum, quote, "a bid to pander to those American visitors who thought Gone with the Wind was a work of history. This at the very time Bermudians were also pursuing their own peaceful struggle for full equality." End quote. The appeal to the lost cause narrative had been, as they worded this, quote, "short-sighted at best, boneheadedly stupid, and terminally insensitive at worst, end quote. And as we move into the next period, I call this professionalization. Bermuda's new governor, Roland Robinson, who was known locally as Lord Martinmere, commended the efforts of the trust and all private organizations who contributed to historical preservation and conservation. As the 1960s saw more hotels and golf courses opening, anxieties about the fate of sites of history and natural beauty continued. They resurfaced. So the governor appointed a museum committee to do two things. One, to come up with a museum policy for all of Bermuda, and two, to find a suitable site to display the Tucker treasure, which they had been trying to do since the end of the 50s. As the committee searched, Bermudian couple Norman and Janes Gates, who were members of the UK National Trust and the Bermuda Historical Society, wrote to the chairman of the committee, Alan Smith. They argue that coordinating all Bermudians interested in history, quote, could result in a most attractive island circuit, which could provide a fund of interest for tourists, either at the sightseeing level or the detailed historians, end quote. The Gateses suggested a national trust of Bermuda, a choice that deliberately referenced national trusts in the United States and the United Kingdom. In 1969, representatives from the Bermuda Historical Society, the St. George's Historical Society, the Garden Club, and the Audubon Society petitioned the governor for a membership society with government backing that would fulfill a dual role of preserving and promoting historic sites, but also open spaces of natural beauty and their conservation. A year-long campaign of gathering signatures ensued. The new trust ideally would be younger, larger, and more democratic. Instead of a small group of wealthy benefactors, a council would decide how to manage trust properties, with 5 of its 13 councilors being elected from general membership. As the House debated the bill to create the National Trust, invest all lands from the old trust within it, some voiced their concerns. For example, David Wilkinson, a nephew of the founder Henry Wilkinson, wished for the bill to acknowledge the old trust founders who funded the preservation themselves and donated land. Members of the newly created Progressive Labor Party largely opposed the bill for differing reasons. Some for the cost of the bill, others made accusations of hypocrisy about preserving land while approving land development in historic areas such as the Holiday Inn over Discovery Beach. But the leader of the opposition, Lois Brown Evans, later Dame Lois, delivered the most critical remarks. Brown Evans took aim at the 5 groups that would receive guaranteed representatives on the Trust Council. These are the 2 historical societies I mentioned, the Garden Club, the Audubon Society, and the Keep Bermuda Beautiful Committee. She claimed that the Garden Club in particular did not welcome black members and argued that the 5 societies would create a national trust that is dominated by the idle rich. She also dismissed Wilkinson's call to recognize his uncles' and others' donations. These were her words. She said they preserved it for their future also, and she refused to go on bended knee because early pioneers or slave masters acquired land that the descendants later donated. She accused the 19th century ancestors of skullduggery, and she also questioned, quote, whether someone that owns half of a parish got it honestly, unquote. United Bermuda member William Cox responded to Brown Evans and said that her speech contained at least one gold nugget. That is, at the very minimum, she supported a national trust. After months of campaigning, the Bermuda National Trust Act passed on December 22nd, 1969, and began operation in 1970. It quickly turned its attention to renovation of its properties. Because of its central location and beauty, the restored Waterville became the new headquarters. To appear professional and unified, the councilors desired a logo at its sites, which many of us have become familiar with, the palmetto tree, which is a symbol of survival and ingenuity. After Waterville, the councilors turned to Tucker House, the Globe Hotel, and Bridge House, which the Monuments Trustees had acquired in 1968. In 1975, the Tucker House opened the Rainey Memorial Room, which honored the first black member of the United States House of Representatives, Joseph Rainey from South Carolina. During the American Civil War, Rainey, who had been formerly enslaved, had fled Confederate conscription and had fled the Confederate South to work in the cellar of Tucker House as a barber. Rainey's story inspired the Tucker House Barbershop exhibit and provided the namesake for Barber's Alley, a small road behind the house. The Trust also restored Globe Hotel and the Confederate Museum within it in 1973. And as for Bridge House, the councilors wished to restore it to its appearance from the early 18th century, when Governor Benjamin Bennett lived there. But they also considered it a site worth considering for a long-proposed maritime museum, given its connection to Bridger Goodrich, the Virginian loyalist fugitive turned privateer, who used Bermuda as a base to capture American vessels during both American and French Revolutionary Wars. But they ultimately settled on renting the building to local and traveling artists, and they made the first floor a gallery. And although the National Trust inherited and renovated several museums, the counselors remained dedicated to one that celebrated Bermuda's rich maritime history. Though they considered sites in St. George's, they decided on the abandoned Royal Naval Dockyard at the West End. After an agreement in which the government would lease the keep yard to the trust, members cleared the dilapidated grounds of government buses, poison ivy, cane grass, and on February 17th, 1975, they welcomed Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, who led school children to the front gate where she was met by Jack Arnell and Andrew Trimingham, and opened the newly christened Bermuda Maritime Museum. Though the museum only boasted the Queen's Exhibition Hall, which featured the Tucker Treasure, and the boat loft building that housed vessels from the age of sail, the mostly volunteer workforce worked tirelessly to expand the new historical attraction. And this next era represents an important shift in Bermudian public history. It is away from wealthy benefactors with an interest in heritage toward one led by credentialed archaeologists and historians. And as such, the interpretations and therefore the public memory of this past would change. First, after the Bermuda Maritime Museum formally separated from the trust in 1978, it spent the next decade overhauling its mission and staff. In 1980, the museum hired the archaeologist Dr. Edward Harris as its first director. Harris was renowned internationally for developing the widely used Harris Matrix, and he gave Bermuda's largest museum professional credibility. His hire also signaled that the Maritime Museum would focus on shipwreck archaeology for the immediate future. In 1983, Harris and the Board of Trustees, who cited, quote, the immense potential of the resources in marine archaeology and history, end quote, archaeology and history in general, end quote, established the Institute of Maritime History and Archaeology as the research arm of the museum. And in 1989, that institute started publishing an academic journal called the Bermuda Journal of Maritime History, of Archaeology and Maritime History, excuse me. Meanwhile, Harris secured a partnership between the museum and East Carolina University, in which students had excavated the Mary Celeste and NOLA Civil War era wrecks. Other schools, such as Brown University, followed. In 1986, after the museum staff converted a World War II barracks into a student hostel, more students came. Proud to say I've stayed there 3 times. The Institute and visiting students would provide the museum with new artifacts and information to use in their exhibits and publications. The museum soon added exhibits to the Sea Venture, the restored dockyard clock, Bermuda's fitted dinghies, and Cable and Wireless, which is a telecommunications company and one of the museum's earliest supporters. But the largest project was the restoration of Commissioner's House. Though Arnell and Trimingham launched the campaign in the 1970s, it took several decades. As part of a project started in the 80s to open an exhibit in time for the 500th anniversary of Columbus's landing in the New World in 1992, Harris wrote up a report and he said he wanted to convert Commissioner's House into offices and storage spaces, but also to use the main floor for future exhibitions. And we see how it turned out. He argued that the government and local businesses stood to gain from contributing to this museum, already the largest tourism attraction in Somerset, and the most professionally staffed museum that Bermuda had to offer. In 1996, Harris further advocated for historic preservation and heritage tourism in a series of essays to the Minister of Tourism called Cultural Tourism, in which he thanked the Bermuda National Trust and its predecessor for their work. He observed that the dockyard was the most visited place in Bermuda, and he wrote that it proved, quote, that the adage that a dollar invested in heritage preservation will return almost tenfold in indirect profits, end quote. In other words, it's not just a educational return, but also an economic return. He later illustrated the relationship between archaeologists, tourism officials, and educators, arguing that the three stood together as, quote, indivisible allies in this movement to conserve historic monuments and archaeological sites, end quote. And he concluded the essays and stated that the three professions shared a common challenge to bring heritage education to the top of the agenda in the tourism trade. And it's perhaps no surprise that Dr. Harris spent the next 5 years lobbying for enhanced legislation to further protect shipwrecks. But there's another key development that happens in the 1990s. First, in 1994, the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, established the Slave Route Project. It's an international collaboration to educate about the transatlantic slave trade and its consequences. Second, after the Progressive Labor Party victory in 1998, the new premier, Jennifer Smith, later Dame Jennifer, and her Minister of Tourism, David Allen, saw an opportunity. Bermuda's own stop on the slave route, called the African Diaspora Heritage Trail. At the 26th International Congress of the Africa Travel Association, which was in Cape Town, South Africa, Premier Smith explained, quote, "The concept entails designated Black cultural and historical sites in Bermuda, the Caribbean, the U.S., and other points in the Western Hemisphere to complement UNESCO's Africa-based slave route project," end quote. Like the founders of the Old Historical Monuments Trust and the leaderships of the National Trust and the Maritime Museum, the Department of Tourism anticipated historical sites would attract American visitors and help revive local businesses that were hurt by tourism's decline. But unlike its predecessors, this Department of Tourism, led by Minister Allen, targeted the lucrative Black American market. The trail would feature many stops, each with a commemorative bronze plaque showing the emblem of the trail, a globe with a raised figure of Bermuda on it, and a raised image of a specific site with an accompanying description. Early additions to this were Tucker House, specifically the Joseph Rainey exhibit, the plaque for which is on the left, Verdmont for its adjoining kitchen where enslaved Bermudians had cooked, and Cobb's Hill Methodist Church, which was completed in 1827 by enslaved Black Bermudians to have a house of worship of their own. In March 1998, after years of negotiating with the trust, Ross Smith and Joy Wilson Tucker opened the newly created Bermuda Heritage Museum, housed here in the Samaritan's Lodge in St. George's, and rented from the National Trust to run it independently. The site once housed the International Order of Good Samaritans, a friendly society that assisted Black Bermudians after emancipation. At the new museum, visitors read about the nature of Bermudian slavery and how it compared to the institution of other British colonies. They could also learn about emancipation, friendly societies, and more modern topics that commemorated Black musicians, athletes, material culture, and of course the Progressive Group's 1959 theater boycott. The Heritage Museum became a stop on this trail naturally. And the Maritime Museum joined them soon thereafter, with two new exhibits. On May 27, 2000, Premier Jennifer Smith dedicated the finally restored Commissioner's House and opened and cut the red tape to these two new exhibits, both researched by historian Dr. Clarence Maxwell and curated by Charlotte Andrews. The panel stressed how the enslaved resisted hardships in Bermuda through poisonings, running away, and even becoming outlaws. Others resisted enslavement in the Americas. They denied their captors of their wealth invested in their bodies, and they jumped from the ships to their deaths. Panels also highlighted skills of enslaved Bermudians who, in a maritime society, would serve by privateering crews, smuggling goods to and from shores, and also piloting smaller vessels as guides for incoming ships. And like the Heritage Museum in St. George's, the Maritime Museum profiled stories of Mary Prince and Sally Bassett, helping visitors better understand the human aspect and cruelty of Bermudian slavery through the eyes of these two women. The first wave of adding trail stops ended with Minister Allen's death in 2002. The campaign stalled for 2 years until Ewart Brown became Minister of Tourism in 2004. Whereas the first wave was mostly comprised of museums and historic buildings, the second featured monuments. Three that I'd like to highlight today are Chesley Trott's When Voices Rise, pictured on the far left, which commemorates the 1959 boycott. His We Arrive, which celebrates the 1835 emancipation of Black Americans who were aboard the Enterprise ship. And on the far right, Carlos Dowling's Spirit of Freedom, which memorializes Sally Bassett, the elderly enslaved woman who was executed in 1730 for her alleged role in a poisoning plot. I want you to while I'm talking, to look at these three monuments and just sort of come up with one word that you feel when looking at each of them. And we can follow up on that during the Q&A. But of the three, I only have time to really discuss in depth one of these, so I'd like to turn attention to Dowling's. In 2008, Ewart Brown, who is now the premier, commissioned Dowling to create a statue of Bassett for the Heritage Trail in time for the 400th anniversary celebrations in 2009. For 28 weeks, Dowling sculpted Bassett, and many disagreed on memorializing her for different reasons. Although many Black Bermudians saw Bassett as a freedom fighter against the evils of slavery, some questioned if it was appropriate to interpret a public monument to slavery as a reminder of historical trauma and believed that racial harmony required moving on from the painful past. Some white Bermudians thought it sent the wrong message, as they viewed Bassett as a criminal who was legally convicted of attempted murder. Those who saw the statue before its official unveiling were horrified at the depiction of an elderly woman who was also somehow pregnant, chained at her wrists and ankles, waiting to be burned. Aside from the statue itself, Bermudians argued over where would be the most fitting site for the memorial. Would it be at Crow Lane, where oral tradition held that she was killed? Would it be in Southampton, where she was from, and the last place she was before she was taken to her execution? What about the City Hall grounds, as Ewart Brown tried to have her put? But on February 9th, 2009, Brown officially dedicated the Spirit of Freedom at the Cabinet House grounds. Several figures spoke here, including scholar Kim Dismont Robinson, who read an excerpt from Trial by Fire, her play about Sally Bassett. But the next remarks, which came from the governor, aroused the most controversy amid an already sensitive subject. The governor acknowledged Bassett as, quote, an icon for many people on the island. Recognition of iconic figures is important elsewhere, too. And then he gave his examples, his three. For South Africa, he chose the Blood River Monument, a bronze replica of 64 covered wagons that commemorated the Boers, who in 1838 repelled Zulu attacks on their encampment. In other words, it is a symbol of Afrikaner nationalism. He then turned to statues of Confederate General Robert E. Lee as his American example. He described Lee as a man who started as a Virginian hero, became a Southern hero, and who, because of his strengths of character, evolved into a U.S. hero, an iconic figure for three sets of Americans in turn. The governor then cited the statue of Oliver Cromwell at the British Parliament, which he called a reminder to the monarch of the perils of ignoring the Parliament. His comments upset many, who found the comparisons to be, at best, bizarre, and at worst, racially insensitive. One columnist remarked, quote, putting the whole lot of them together, one statue honoring those who suffered under white domination, and statues honoring those who fought for white rule over blacks, is bound to be offensive to a lot of people, end quote. The governor insisted he meant no offense, and argued that his three examples related to Bassett because all three received adulation only from their fellow countrymen and long after their deaths. But his distinction hardly applied to Robert E. Lee. Although Lee died in 1870, 13 years before the Lee Memorial Association unveiled the recumbent Lee statue in Richmond, Virginia, the lost cause narrative I mentioned earlier, which worked to restore his honor and memory, it already began during his final years of life. And moreover, Lee had headed an army and defended a government that was intent on perpetuating enslavement and racial oppression. To compare him to an enslaved black woman who was executed by her government made little historical sense. Sometime before, Dame Jennifer Smith argued that Sally Bassett contributed to a more complete view of Bermudian history. In a reference to a 1994 tourist brochure that was quickly recalled, Smith said, it has been often said that slavery in Bermuda was benign. The Sally Bassett story puts aside this myth. Slavery by its nature cannot be benign. End quote. So though white colonial figures long had dominated Bermuda's sites of public history and memory, the 1990s and the early 2000s brought Black Bermudians into this conversation over new historical interpretation and provided the mechanisms of historical production to make it happen. As UNESCO established its Slave Route Project, and as the National Trust began redeveloping its own public image at its sites, the emergence of a new government using this power to produce new histories and did so to inspire the reshaping of Bermudians' perceptions of the island's heritage. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. You covered a lot in a very limited amount of time. I
I
applaud you.
tried.
No, I appreciate it. Um, it's such an interesting topic because obviously when we think about history, we think about things that happened in the distant past. And
Mhm.
we're also talking about things, certainly with your topic, that happened very much within living memory for many people.
Mhm.
Um, we're also talking about history that is not, I think some people, when they think of histories, sometimes think it's maybe sterile, it happened in the past, but it's very
Mhm.
much not. It's very much an emotional thing that a lot of people connect with, and revisiting not just the history and asking new questions of that history, but also looking at how we tell those stories and how that changes over time is incredibly important. And I'm mindful of, the National Trust, the museum as well, and others are revisiting their exhibits now that,
Mhm.
although at the time that they were made, were certainly at a point and told a story.
Mhm.
Now they do not, the telling of that story needs to be advanced to where we are today, and to revisit those exhibits and add new information,
Mhm.
and to provide more context and things like that is incredibly important. And I'm just very grateful that you would come on and share your PhD with research with us. So I'm
Happy.
not going to take up too much time because I'm mindful that we do have a number of questions coming in. So
Okay.
the first question has to do with your research. And
Yeah.
it says, was there a moment during your research where you thought, oh, this changes how I see history?
Yeah. Well, I've had plenty of opportunities to research Bermuda. I've been very fortunate. In my MA, my master's work, maybe I was perhaps young and naive. I always thought the archives could always tell the story. And something as I've gotten older and had more experience with history and certainly with public history is that it's always important to remember that the sources that are left behind, that decision is made for you by somebody else. Somebody else decides what is worth remembering, what is worth being kept and preserved in archives. And so when I think about history differently, I think of it is as much a reflection of our current time period as it is of what we're actually talking about. A good example of this would be in American history. For much of the 20th century, Woodrow Wilson was revered as one of the top presidents of U.S. history. But ever since the 2000s, historians have drawn much more attention to his segregated government, and so he's been reviewed much less favorably, and certainly by conservatives for the income tax. But it's interesting to see what the values of people in a given moment feel about a historical topic and how we come to those different conclusions.
Great. So another question that's come in, uh, what do you think audiences today still tend to still tend to underestimate about how public spaces and public history are shaped?
Okay. Um, well, the first thing, again, I've been to Bermuda 3 times, and I think one of the lessons I've learned is that tourists are not passive actors. Um, as someone who, as a tourist to Bermuda, I know that I have my own biases and expectations. I also understand that I might not be able to understand Bermudan history the way someone who's lived there their entire life can. So when I think about public spaces and history and how it caters to, in this case, much of what my research is arguing is that it catered to a specific element of business. Um, there's a lot of studies in anthropology that talk about the tourist gaze and the idea that you see what you're intended to see, what is being sold to you. Um, and so, yeah, I think that's something like maybe I perhaps naively didn't consider when I started, not just Bermuda, but anywhere I've ever traveled. I've been trying to be more mindful of what history is being presented and what's the purpose of the history, what's the relationship with the community.
Yeah, and I'm also to that point, I think there's an interesting shift that we're seeing now where history is very much a community action. It's a community
Hmm.
activity, and we're seeing that co-curation.
Hmm.
And, certainly in the tourism realm, especially, walking tours are being done by locals and they're crafting those tours to tell the story as they see it and through the research that they've done. And using that local knowledge is incredibly, first off, it's just very interesting to see history from someone else's perspective. I think that's what I find
Hmm.
most exciting is, I can have certain questions of history, but when I have these conversations with colleagues or friends, they have very different questions of the same history. And through that kind of those different perspectives, we can get a better
Hmm.
understanding and a more concise understanding of that history.
Hmm.
Um, so seeing the community engage with the history and sharing those stories, seeing the role that family history plays in how we understand our history, I think we're seeing a big growth in that as well.
Hmm.
So it's interesting to see how that's going to navigate into museum spaces and into public spaces, certainly.
Hmm.
But very much so, visitors do drive a lot of admissions for
Hmm.
local museums. And I think definitely we're seeing that shift from catering to visitors
Yeah,
to sharing our history with them as
right.
told by locals. And I think seeing that shift is really exciting and encouraging for the next 10, 20, 30 years of museum work and heritage work in
Hmm.
Bermuda for sure.
Hmm.
So we've got another couple more questions coming in.
Okay.
This has to do with your research for your manuscript.
Yeah,
So, as you expand your research for the manuscript, what themes or perspectives do you hope to focus on that you did not get to explore in the dissertation?
sure. It's a great question. And obviously, one of the limits of a dissertation is being on the time limit of a doctoral student. So I am excited to actually be able to work a little more open-ended and look at some of the gaps in the research. One of them was, as I mentioned earlier, the archives themselves. I know that the Bermuda archives have had has had different leadership over the last 20 years. And I was considering looking into any news about that and maybe looking at what collections were preserved, what was donated. Um, I also am I also am trying to expand more on perhaps how the African Diaspora Heritage Trail, maybe how it's been redeveloped in interpretation. For example, there was I can't remember, the name of the author escapes me. Somebody wrote an article about it, about St. George's being a UNESCO site, and was saying how it connects Bermuda to a global tourist-centric conversation. But Debbie, to your point about focusing more on history for the community first, wanted to maybe look into, has there been any sort of update on some of these sites since they received their plaques in the 2000s? Yeah.
Excellent. So we have a question here, another one, and I'm mindful
Mhm.
of time as well. Um, how do you feel about supermodernity and preservation in the sense of your research and a still unfolding national or cultural identity?
Um, Brad, I might want to have the question clarified. I'm just trying to make sure I totally understand.
Okay, I will see if we can get clarification from
Forgive me, I'm
person.
just a
Yeah,
little confused.
no problem. I guess I think how I read it is, in an area where we have kind of this ultra globalization and
Okay.
there's almost I don't say a loss of places, but um, kind of liminal places, I think is where I'm thinking and things like that.
Hmm.
Um, and preservation and this idea of kind of the rapid expansion of technological advancement. Uh,
Hmm.
how does that relate to preservation, especially in a country where our national and our cultural identity is still unfolding? I think maybe, but
Yeah, and I wonder too, because we're, increasingly in this digital age, and in theory, that would make history and memory more accessible, not having to always physically be there. But I wonder to what extent it's lost when people can't actually visit sites, and can't actually handle the material culture itself or actually sit down and understand that. So, though history and memory are always evolving together, distinct but together, I do wonder um, the place of brick and mortar exhibits and digital exhibits, and perhaps interactive exercises on our devices. So I don't know how that's going to change perception of memory in Bermuda, but I know here it seems that one of the few ways we can get people to care about history is, you sort of put it somewhere they're already at. So,
yeah, I'm also mindful that, when we're talking about public history, we have looked more specific, and I know your research focused on Bermuda and
mhm,
also looking at America as well in the US.
mhm.
But I'm also mindful that, the global South, the Caribbean,
Yeah,
South America, and other places are viewing and viewing history or viewing the ways in which they share history slightly differently,
mhm.
and progressing it within their own kind of cultural contexts and communities. So yeah, I think like I said before, I think the research, it's going to be interesting to see how that develops because very much, history is not static and neither is the public history field. So
Right.
it'll be interesting to see what trends come out and what the next chapter looks like.
Hmm.
So we have one more question that I'm going to ask. And
Sure.
it is, what do you think would be the most important aspect for future legislation regarding heritage / archaeological management?
The most, say that again, most important
Aspect
aspect.
Yeah, for future legislation.
Well, I think public history and public memory are they're effectively an extension of civic participation, right? Understanding your history, knowing your country, knowing how we all sort of got here, and that we're all here as the consequences of decisions made by others, but here we are nonetheless, living with those consequences. It is part of identity, right? And so I think that to your point earlier about working with schools and working with children and working to put the community first, I feel as if yes, money's important, but trying to decouple it from the business side of it would be really important. And focusing on simply just reinstilling civic pride and having a more informed citizenry.
Okay. Well, I think that's it for our questions for this evening. But I'll just have a caveat to anyone who maybe has a question or is thinking of a question but hasn't asked it. Please do feel free to email us. You can contact us at curator@nmb.bm, or contact the museum at info@nmb.bm. And we will pass your questions on to Dr. Goodrich, and see if he can get you an answer for those questions. But yeah, with that all being said, Alex, are there any final words you'd like to share?
I just want to say thanks again for having me. It's an honor to do this. I know a lot of great historians and scholars have done these lecture series before, so to be included with them is really cool. And also, yeah, I mean, Bermuda and especially the National Museum have always been very hospitable to me. So thank you again.
It's our pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Um, with that, we're going to conclude the webinar. And again, if you have any questions, please do be in touch. And for those of you that registered, we will be emailing out the link to the recording next week. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.